A furious shout shattered the stillness of the night. "Do you have any idea how much this dish costs?" The sound of knives stopped. A glass froze midair, and for one suspended second, the elegant restaurant of Hawthorne and Pine seemed trapped in time. Golden light spilled across the marble table, reflecting the furious face of Graham Whitaker, the tech billionaire in a black suit as sharp as judgment itself. His cold gray eyes swept the room before locking onto the young waitress standing just a few steps away, Sophie Carter. She tightened her grip on the tray, her fingers trembling with fear, but her voice remained calm and steady. "Sir, please allow me." "Don't bother!" He snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. The entire dining room went silent. The piano music halted mid-note. A couple at the next table leaned slightly to watch, whispering to each other. Someone carefully set their glass down, afraid even the clink of crystal would draw attention. In that tense quiet, Sophie stood exposed under the lights as if on stage, and her audience was the most powerful and merciless crowd in Chicago. Sophie Carter, 29 years old, was no stranger to nights like this. Every step she took in this restaurant was a performance, from the way she bowed, placed a glass, to how her smile had to be warm enough to please, but never too familiar. At Hawthorne and Pine, a single sigh out of rhythm could cost her job. But tonight, the air felt heavier than usual, because table number 9 had him. Before Graham Whitaker arrived, Sophie had been arranging the silver cutlery for her 4th table. She remembered Victor Hale, the maitre d', whispering, "Be careful tonight, Carter. Don't make mistakes. This guest doesn't like to be disturbed or contradicted." She only nodded, forcing a polite smile, because in this world, not contradicting meant surviving. She had survived long enough through 2 jobs, late nights, and a little girl at home fast asleep. Mia, 7 years old, always asked Mom, "Can I take ballet classes?" And Sophie always replied with a tired smile, "When I get a few more good tips, sweetheart." For her, every tip was a small dream: a tutu, a pair of ballet shoes, or one more tutoring lesson for her daughter. That was why she chose silence, why she chose to bow her head. But tonight, silence became a blade pressed to her throat. Graham sat in the corner of the room, leaning back in a leather chair beside Ben Archer, his young and cautious associate. 2 bodyguards in black suits sat a few tables away, pretending to be ordinary diners. Their table was the center of attention, not just because of who he was, but because of how Graham commanded space with his presence. When he was angry, the entire room froze. Sophie had just approached when it happened. A drop of sauce fell on the edge of the plate, just that. But to a man like Graham, it was an insult. He tapped the table lightly, his voice lowering into a mocking tone. "Is this how this restaurant serves its guests?" A wave of heat rose up Sophie's neck. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her chest, each thump echoing through the silence. Every eye turned toward her, as if the whole world was waiting to see her fall apart. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry. I'll replace it right away," she said, her words perfectly measured, but her hands trembling. "Don't replace it. Just get out of my sight," he said, his tone biting, before turning to Ben with a thin smirk. "It's sad to pay this much and still get incompetence." Ben lowered his head and murmured, Maybe she just made a small mistake, Graham." But Graham wasn't listening. He took a slow sip of his wine, eyes full of disdain. Sophie bowed low and turned away. Every cell in her body screamed, "Don't cry." She bit her lip until she tasted salt. From across the room, Victor gave a small shake of his head, signaling her to stay calm. But in his eyes, she saw something worse than pity familiarity. She had seen that look so many times before from people who looked at her like she was invisible. A nameless server with no right to speak, only a smile trained to perfection. The world of tailored suits and luxury watches never cared if she had feelings. But tonight, Something inside Sophie bent and tightened like a string pulled to its breaking point. Graham continued his meal, unaware that his arrogance was about to trigger a storm that would make an entire city stop and listen. Because tonight in that restaurant, an ordinary woman was about to speak one sentence that would make everything come to a halt. And the world would know her name, Sophie Carter. That night, the atmosphere inside Hawthorne and Pine felt like a sealed stage, where every breath and every faint clink of glass followed its own script. But at table 9, everything had gone off course. As Victor Hale, the maitre d', quietly walked toward the kitchen, Graham Whitaker's voice still cut through the air like a blade. A restaurant of this reputation, allowing guests to witness this utterly shameful. Sophie stood motionless, the tray still in her hands, her eyes fixed on the table, trying to hide the trembling of her fingers. A few guests began murmuring again, as if to mask the tension, but the silence still hung over the room like a thin sheet of glass. In the kitchen, Chef Marcus Corbett slammed his knife against the board, his face flushed with anger. He said the steak was cooked wrong. Victor gave a small nod. He called rare raw. Don't react. Just redo it. Marcus clenched his teeth, the sound of metal clashing sharp in the air. A man who eats power for breakfast doesn't know the difference between rare and raw. But he still turned back to the grill, his movements fast, precise, and cold. Sophie waited by the door, her back straight, eyes locked on the clock on the wall. Each passing second matched the rhythm of her fear, the fear of being fired, of making another mistake, of saying what she truly thought. When the new steak was ready, she took a deep breath. Steam rose from the plate, carrying the scent of seared butter, black garlic, and Wagyu beef. She whispered, "Please don't let this get any worse," then stepped out of the kitchen. Table 9 looked frozen under the golden lights. Graham Whitaker was scrolling through his phone fingers, moving quickly, his brows furrowed, lips pressed tight. Beside him, Ben Archer leaned over his laptop, reading emails, doing his best to avoid attention. The two bodyguards sat farther away, their eyes sharp and still like glass. Sophie placed the plate down carefully. "Sir, the dish has been corrected to your specifications." Graham didn't look up. It had better be. She began to pour the wine, her movements slow and precise, but just as the bottle tilted, Graham interrupted. "Steady your hand. I don't need another wine spill on my table." Sophie froze. For a moment, just one moment, she wanted to set the bottle down and walk away, but she bowed her head slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir." Across the table, Ben looked at her with quiet sympathy. "He's had a rough week," he murmured as if in apology, though the words did nothing to soften the blow. Sophie stepped back, her hands clasped behind her, her eyes forward, the posture Victor had taught her, calm as the surface of a lake, even when storms raged beneath. Graham cut into the steak, tasted, then set his knife down. A slight frown. A breath. "At least it's edible this time," he said, his tone flat. Sophie turned to leave when a sharp clatter rang out, the sound of a knife striking the plate. The clang echoed all the way to the bar. "You!" he barked louder now. "Listen carefully. A place that charges this much and hires people like you will collapse sooner or later." Every eye in the room turned toward them. At the next table, a couple stopped talking. Across the room, the pianist hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keys before falling silent. It was as if the air itself had been drained from the space. Sophie turned back. She saw Graham's lips move again, every word heavy as a hammer. "You have no skill. You are the definition of mediocrity. I pay to be served, not to teach people how to work." Victor rushed forward, sweat forming on his forehead. "Mr. Whitaker, we apologize." Don't apologize for her." Graham shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The wine glass trembled amber liquid splashing over the rim. Sophie took a step back. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she forced them down. In her mind, she heard Mia's voice, "Mom, don't be sad." "Okay, when I grow up, I'll buy you a pretty dress." She inhaled deeply, the scent of Riesling sharp in her throat. "Sir, if the dish is still not satisfactory, I'll have the kitchen prepare another one." "No need," he cut in his voice like steel. "What you need to learn isn't cooking, it's silence." Victor opened his mouth to speak, but Ben caught his arm, whispering, "Let him vent. The more we interfere, the worse it gets." But Sophie heard every word. Each syllable struck her chest, not as an insult, but as something that cracked open a part of her she had kept locked away for too long. She looked around. Everyone was watching her, not with contempt, but with pity. And somehow that hurt more than humiliation. A single tear slipped down, falling onto the marble floor. No one else heard it, but she did the sound of something breaking inside her. In that moment, only one thought remained fragile as a thread about to snap. "I've endured enough." Outside the glass windows, Chicago lay cloaked in a cold night. Inside, the golden lights reflected in Sophie's tear-filled eyes. And no one could have imagined that within minutes, this quiet waitress would bring the entire restaurant to a standstill. The air grew so thick it felt as though all the oxygen had been drained from hawthorn and pine. Every gaze was fixed on Table 9, where Graham Whitaker sat leaning back in his chair, seething with anger and arrogance. The golden light above cast harsh lines across his face, revealing every cold, commanding feature. "Where I come from," he said through gritted teeth, "employees like you would be fired on the spot, not wait for a customer to remind them." Victor Hale struggled to keep his tone calm. "Sir, we will—" "Enough!" Graham interrupted, his voice slicing through the air. "I'm not talking to management. I'm talking to her." The entire dining room fell silent. Even the background music stopped dead. At the bar, the bartender froze mid-polish cloth suspended in his hand. A young waitress in the corner quietly turned away, terrified of meeting his eyes. Sophie Carter stood straight, both hands clenched in front of her apron. Her eyes, which had always been lowered, slowly lifted. Her face was pale, but her gaze was clear and bright. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling yet steady, "I'm sorry if the service was not perfect, but I've done my very best." Graham laughed short and bitter. "Your best? Then you should rethink what best means." Ben Archer, the younger associate seated beside him, winced slightly and said quietly, just loud enough for Graham to hear, "Graham, maybe that's enough." "Be quiet," Graham snapped. "I'm teaching a lesson, one everyone in this restaurant should hear." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping back hard. "I've managed thousands of employees, and if anyone behaved like you, slow, clumsy, stupid, they'd be out of my company in 5 minutes. People like you don't belong in a place this refined." The words dropped into a silence so heavy it almost vibrated. Other diners bowed their heads. A middle-aged woman whispered, "Oh my God," then fell silent. In that moment, Sophie saw herself, not in front of Graham, but in all the countless times she had been treated like this before. The nights when customers yelled because their wine was 2 minutes late, the whispered ridicule behind her back as she bowed, the looks of pity when people saw her working past midnight, and a voice inside her whispered, "Enough, Sophie." She took a deep breath and lifted her head. Her slender shoulders trembled slightly, but her voice rose steady, warm, unbroken. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, no longer calling him sir, "you can buy a steak, but you can't buy kindness." The words were soft, but they struck the air like thunder. For a moment, no one could believe what they had heard. Then the room sank into absolute silence. Ben froze. Victor's mouth fell open. Somewhere, a glass slipped and shattered on the floor. Graham stood still, his face red with fury, his eyes wide. "What did you just say?" Sophie repeated slower this time, each word piercing through his arrogance like a needle. "I said you can buy anything you want, but you cannot buy decency." Her voice wasn't loud yet, it carried spreading across the room like ripples on still water. At the table by the window, a guest began to clap softly. Then another joined in. And another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause, loud and rolling like thunder on a quiet night. Graham staggered, his face twisted in rage. "How dare you?" he hissed through clenched teeth. "Do you have any idea who I am? I could buy this entire restaurant and have you thrown out tonight." Sophie did not back away, even as her heart pounded in her chest. "I know exactly who you are," she said calmly. "But that doesn't give you the right to treat people like dirt." Victor started forward to intervene, but stopped. There was something in Sophie's eyes, an unshakable calm, a light so steady it made him freeze. Graham drew a shaky breath, his hand trembling as it clenched around his phone. "You'll regret this," he spat. "I'll make sure you never work in this city again." He threw a wad of cash onto the table. "Take it," he sneered. "It's worth the cheap steak." Then he turned sharply and stormed out. His two bodyguards followed close behind. Ben stayed where he was, his eyes fixed on Sophie, no longer filled with pity, but with respect. "You're braver than most," he said softly. The door closed behind them. From the hallway, the faint sound of a wind chime drifted in. Inside, the silence that followed was not one of fear, but of awakening. Sophie stood there, the wine tray still in her hands, her breath quick and uneven. She could hardly believe what she had just said. An older woman walked up to her, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. "You said what every one of us wanted to say." Sophie smiled faintly, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. She bowed her head. "I just couldn't take it anymore." The woman nodded. Sometimes it only takes one voice for the whole world to listen. From behind the bar, Chef Marcus stood watching through the kitchen window. A small smile crossed his face. "She did what the rest of us forgot to do," he murmured. "She kept her dignity." That night, the lights of Chicago still blazed across the skyline. But inside that restaurant, another kind of light had been lit, a quiet, steadfast flame that no one could ever extinguish. When the doors of Hawthorne and Pine closed behind Graham Whitaker, the room remained frozen in silence, as if everyone was afraid that even breathing too loudly would shatter the air. Only when the echo of his footsteps faded did the hearts of those inside begin to beat again. A few people glanced at one another, unsure what to say, until someone started clapping. Just once. Then another joined, and another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant filled with applause, a thunderous ovation for the waitress, who had dared to say what no one else would. Sophie Carter stood still, the tray still in her hands, her palms slick with sweat. She didn't smile, nor did she tremble anymore. Only her breath came fast and shallow, and her heart pounded so hard it seemed to echo in her throat. She could hardly believe what she had just done. Carter Victor Hale, the maitre d', approached carefully, his voice low as if afraid to disturb the fragile moment. "Are you all right?" Sophie nodded slightly. "I think I am." He exhaled, his shoulders easing. "I don't know what will happen after tonight, but you reminded me that we're still human." From the kitchen, Chef Marcus Corbett emerged, his apron still stained with sauce, his eyes gleaming with pride. "If I were 20 years younger, I'd have said that for you." He chuckled hoarsely, his voice trembling. "You did the right thing, Sophie. Absolutely right." A few guests rose to shake her hand. A woman in a red dress placed a $100 bill on her tray and said softly, "Thank you for speaking up for everyone who's ever been looked down on." Sophie bowed her head, unable to find her voice. But as the clapping slowly faded, reality began to sink in. Graham Whitaker was not just any customer. He was a man who could buy out an entire brand with a single phone call. She swallowed hard, still holding the tray close to her chest like a fragile shield. In her mind, Mia's voice echoed, "Mom, when you're sad, don't stay silent." Sophie pressed her lips together and slowly walked out of the dining room, heading down the hallway toward the back exit. Each step sounded like the drumbeat of her racing heart. Outside, the Chicago wind howled through the glass towers. She stood in the narrow alley, leaning against the cold brick wall, her breath forming small clouds in the night air. She untied her apron, rolled it in her hands, and looked up at the silver-gray sky. One tear fell, then another. She had just done the one thing she had spent her whole life avoiding. She had spoken the truth. And that truth might cost her everything. Behind her, the door creaked open. Marcus appeared holding an unlit cigarette. He leaned beside her. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. "The first time I told my boss I wouldn't cook for someone who insulted my staff, I was fired the next day." Sophie turned surprised. "But that was also the day I opened my first restaurant," he added, laughing softly, his voice gravelly. "Sometimes losing is the only way to find yourself." Sophie bit her lip, fighting the lump in her throat. "Thank you, chef." He patted her shoulder. "Go wash your face, then come back. We still have the late shift." Sophie nodded and returned to the staff room. In the mirror, her face was streaked with tears, her lipstick smudged. She took off her jacket, fixed her hair, and rinsed her hands in cold water. Looking at her reflection, she realized that, for the first time in her life, she didn't see weakness. When she stepped back into the dining area, the restaurant was nearly closed. The last few guests were leaving, still glancing back at her with admiration. Victor was settling the day's accounts. Seeing her, he said quietly, "I've called the owner. There's a meeting with all staff in the morning. Be ready." Sophie froze. "Does that mean I don't know?" He said, "Maybe good, maybe not. But either way, you've earned everyone's respect." She nodded, not daring to ask more. Stepping outside, the night wind swept through, carrying away strands of her tear-damp hair. On the street, headlights blurred into flowing ribbons of light. She boarded the late train toward Logan Square, sitting quietly as her reflection swayed in the fogged window. Her hand still held the apron crumpled in her lap like a relic from the storm she had just survived. She recalled every look from the restaurant: shock, fear, then admiration. And Graham's furious glare, the one she knew would come back for her. The train rattled softly as it crossed the steel bridge. Only a few passengers remained. Sophie closed her eyes and wondered, "Will I lose my job?" Then she thought of Mia, of her bright eyes, talking about her first ballet lesson. A faint smile formed between tears. Whatever happens tomorrow, she had protected the one thing that mattered most: her dignity. Outside the window, Chicago gleamed in its sleepless brilliance. But inside, Sophie, another light had been kindled, the quiet, unwavering light of courage, of truth, and of the belief that sometimes one honest sentence is enough to change an entire life. The next morning, Sophie Carter was not awakened by her alarm, but by the relentless vibration of her old phone rattling against the nightstand. She frowned, pulling herself out of a restless sleep, her head still buzzing from the chaos of the night before. When the screen's glow hit her face, she blinked repeatedly. Messages, missed calls, dozens of notifications. She unlocked the phone and the world poured in. The first headline on social media read, "Waitress stands up to billionaire at Chicago's most elite restaurant, says one sentence that silenced the room." Below it was a shaky video filmed from a table near the window. The image wobbled, but it was clear enough. Graham Whitaker furious, and then her own voice soft but distinct. "You can buy a steak, but you can't buy kindness." Sophie froze. Her heartbeat quickened so fast it almost hurt. She scrolled through the flood of comments bursting like a storm. "She's a legend." Finally, someone said, what we've all been thinking. Graham Whitaker is known for humiliating staff. He got what he deserved. The hashtag you can't buy. Decency had already soared to the top of the trending list. Sophie sat there dazed, the phone slipping from her fingers and landing on the crumpled blanket. She stared at the ceiling, feeling as if she'd been swept into a whirlwind she never meant to start. The bedroom door creaked open. Mia peeked in her hair a mess, clutching her stuffed bear. "Mom, aren't you going to work?" Sophie startled. "Oh, yes, I'm getting ready." "I saw you on the phone," Mia said matter-of-factly. "My friend said you're famous now." Sophie blinked. "What on the internet? You said something about steak and kindness." Sophie sank into the chair. Children were incredible. They didn't understand the weight of the world. They just saw their mother being seen. The phone rang again. It was Marta, her co-worker from last night's shift. "Sophie, have you seen it? You're viral. The owners called a meeting at noon. Everyone has to be there." Her voice trembled. "Do you think they're going to fire me? I don't know. But the press won't stop calling. There are reporters waiting outside the restaurant." Sophie's heart sank. She walked to the window, staring out at the bright Chicago streets. The city moved as it always did, busy and different, but to her, everything had changed. Last night she had spoken a single sentence to protect her dignity, and now the entire city was talking about it. By noon, outside, Hawthorne and Pine news vans lined the street. Cameras, microphones, voices shouting over one another. "Ms. Carter, can you tell us how you feel right now? Are you afraid Graham Whitaker might sue you?" She kept her head down, slipping through the crowd as Victor Hale hurried to open the door for her. "Quick, Sophie." The meeting's in the private dining room. Inside, every staff member was already seated. No one spoke. The only sound was the steady tick of the clock. At the head of the table sat Leah Porter, the owner of the restaurant, a woman in her 50s with neatly tied silver hair and eyes sharp enough to command silence. Beside her were Chef Marcus Corbett and Victor. Leah tapped the table lightly. "I'm sure you've all seen the video. We are now the center of national attention. This story is everywhere, and the name Hawthorne and Pine is on every channel." The air grew tight. She turned her gaze toward Sophie. "Carter, I want to hear from you first." "Do you have anything to say?" Sophie rose. Her voice was small but steady. "I never meant to harm the restaurant's reputation. I just couldn't stand how he spoke to people." A moment of silence. Leah studied her for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, a faint smile touched her lips. "You know I've watched that video at least 10 times. Leah said, her voice calm but weighted. "And every time I feel prouder. Proud that someone here had the courage to put dignity above money." A wave of whispers spread through the room. Marcus nodded firmly. "I agree," Victor exhaled, relieved. "Thank God." Leah continued, her tone unwavering. "This afternoon, I'll make a public statement. Hawthorne and Pine stands with its employees. We do not tolerate guests, no matter how wealthy, disrespecting another human being." The room erupted in applause. Sophie sank back into her seat, her eyes filling with tears. She had never imagined the day would come when someone would defend her instead of blame her. Leah looked around, her voice resolute. "And remember this from today. Ms. Carter's words are no longer just words. They are the spirit of this place." When the meeting ended, Marcus walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't just change your own life, Carter. You changed how we see this job." Sophie smiled through tears, her eyes shining. Outside, the crowd of reporters still waited. But inside her heart, the storm from the night before was turning into something new. Not fear anymore, but a rising wave of hope. That afternoon, snowflakes drifted lazily over the streets of Chicago. Outside Hawthorne and Pine, reporters still crowded the entrance. Microphones raised high camera flashes bursting like hundreds of searching eyes. When Leah Porter, the owner of the restaurant, stepped out beside Sophie Carter, the crowd erupted with shouts. "Mrs. Porter, are you planning to fire her? Sophie, are you afraid of being sued by Graham Whitaker? Do you have anything to say to the people supporting you online?" Sophie bowed her head slightly, her hands clutching her apron, but Leah gently placed a hand on her shoulder, signaling her to stay calm. Then Leah turned to face the cameras, her voice firm and ringing with steel. "No one is being fired. We do not punish people for standing up for kindness. Hawthorne and Pine will always be a place where people are respected before they are employees." The statement was brief, but its impact rippled like a wave. That day, the entire city of Chicago was talking about the restaurant. From the evening news to millions of shared tweets, the name Sophie Carter became an unexpected symbol of dignity in service. As the sunset bathed the city in gold, Sophie sat in the corner of a small cafe a few blocks away, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate ice, fixed on the television mounted on the wall. Footage of her from the previous night filled the screen everywhere, the young woman with tearful eyes, but a steady voice daring to tell a billionaire that money cannot buy kindness. Across from her, Marta, her co-worker from the previous shift, grinned. "Have you seen this? You're on national TV. Who would have thought a waitress from Logan Square would have the whole country talking?" Sophie gave a faint smile. "I just said what anyone should have said." "Yes, but not everyone has the courage to say it." Marta replied with a shrug. "By the way, CNN wants to interview you tonight." Sophie froze. "Me? Oh no, I don't want to be famous." Marta laughed. "You're not becoming famous, Sophie. You're becoming a voice for people like us." "You get that?" The words silenced her. She turned to look out through the fogged window. The streets outside were still bustling, unaware that somewhere in this city, a woman was caught between two fears, the fear of losing her job and the fear of never daring to live honestly again. That night, when she returned to her small apartment, Mia ran to her clutching a tablet in her hands. "Mom, you're on the internet. I saw you on YouTube." Sophie laughed, pulling her daughter into a hug. "Oh goodness, you've seen it already." "Yes, you were amazing. My teacher saw it too. She said you're the bravest person she's ever seen." Sophie looked at her daughter, her eyes glistening. "Sweetheart, I just want you to remember, no matter who looks down on you, you must always know who you are. Do you understand?" Mia nodded firmly. "I understand. You're my superhero mom." The innocent words made Sophie cry again, but this time not out of fear but relief. For years she had pushed herself to be everything, to be the good employee, the patient mother, the one who always endured. But only when she spoke that truth did she finally feel alive. The next morning, an envelope arrived at the restaurant. The sender, Graham Whitaker. Leah opened it, skimmed through, and frowned slightly. He didn't apologize, but he's not suing either. He just wrote, "I will never return to this restaurant again." Marcus chuckled. "That's the best news I've heard all month." Leah folded the letter and handed it to Sophie. "Keep it. Consider it a souvenir. One chapter ends." Sophie held the paper, her fingers trembling slightly. Graham's signature was sharp and precise, like the man himself. She looked at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully. And another chapter begins. In the days that followed, people flocked to Hawthorne and Pine, not just for the food, but for the story. For the waitress named Sophie Carter. Some left $20 bills with scribbled notes, for the woman who reminded us what respect means. Sophie didn't know what the future held, but one afternoon, Leah Porter invited her into the office. On the desk sat a steaming cup of tea and a thin envelope. "Sophie," Leah said softly, "a friend of mine wants to meet you. He heard your story and wants to discuss a social initiative." I think you should say yes. A social initiative? Sophie asked, surprised. Leah smiled. It's called Project Decency. When Sophie left the office, the night wind swept through the corridor carrying the scent of coffee and baked bread. She didn't know where her path would lead next, but she knew one thing for certain: that sentence she had spoken in a moment of courage no longer belonged to her alone. It had become the voice of thousands who had once been dismissed, silenced, or overlooked, and were now beginning to stand tall. And somewhere in the bright, sleepless city of Chicago, people still spoke of the woman who made an entire restaurant fall silent, not out of fear, but because of one sentence that reminded the world what kindness truly means. 3 days later, Hawthorne and Pine had returned to its usual rhythm, but the atmosphere was different. The restaurant was busier than ever. Wealthy patrons, college students, even ordinary office workers came not just for dinner, but to see for themselves the waitress who had silenced a billionaire. Sophie Carter walked through the hallway, a wine tray in her hand, her smile soft and composed. Every glance that met her carried a trace of admiration. She wasn't used to it. For her, this job had always meant survival, a way to pay bills, buy groceries, and keep her daughter's small dreams alive. It had never been about attention. From the kitchen, chef Marcus Corbett poked his head out, his rough voice echoing Carter Table 8's asking for you. They said they want to be served by the famous waitress. Laughter rippled through the kitchen. Sophie shook her head, but a small smile curved her lips. Even the famous ones still have to wipe down tables, chef. Amid the laughter, Victor Hale, the maitre d', appeared. Sophie, there's someone here to see you. Someone, yes. He said Mrs. Leah Porter approved the visit. He's waiting in the lounge. She wiped her hands, adjusted her black shirt, and walked toward the bar area. The atmosphere there was warm and quiet, the amber light reflecting off the glasses. A man stood by the counter, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a simple gray suit, with kind eyes and a calm smile. When he turned and saw her, he smiled as though greeting an old friend. You must be Sophie Carter. Yes, I am. He extended his hand. I'm Thomas Avery, an old friend of Leah Porter. The name made Sophie pause. Avery, a name she had read countless times in business articles. Founder of one of Boston's leading technology foundations and a pioneer in medical automation. She shook his hand nervously, her heart racing. It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Avery. Please call me Thomas. I'm not fond of titles, he said with a warm chuckle, the fine lines around his eyes deepening. I'm not here to talk about the restaurant. I'm here to talk about you. Sophie sat down uneasy. Thomas placed his phone on the table and turned the screen toward her. It was the video from that night. The moment she spoke those words, the restaurant froze, then erupted in applause. He paused there and looked at her. Do you know why this moment moved millions of people? Sophie shook her head. I just said what I felt. Exactly. Thomas nodded. In a world where everything is measured by money, people have forgotten the value of decency, and you with one sentence reminded them. He took out an envelope and slid it toward her. Leah and I are launching a new initiative, Project Decency. It's designed to support and protect people in the service industry, those who face pressure, exhaustion, and disrespect every day. We want you to be its first representative. Sophie's eyes widened. Me? I'm just a waitress. I don't have any special skills. Thomas smiled gently, his eyes kind. You have what money can't buy: real experience. No one understands the weight of this job better than you. We don't need a hero. We need someone real. Sophie clasped her hands together, overwhelmed. All her life she had known only how to serve, how to earn just enough, how to teach her daughter to be patient and kind. And now someone was asking her to stand for something far greater than herself. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered. Thomas tilted his head slightly. You don't have to know right away. Think about it. We'll send you the details. If you agree, you'll speak at small gatherings, share your story, and help build a network for others like you once were. Her hands trembled as she looked down at the polished table. In the reflection of the light, she saw her own face, a woman who once bowed to customers now being asked to stand tall while the world listened. Finally, she looked up, her voice soft but steady. If what I went through can help someone else feel less small, then I'll do it. Thomas smiled, rising from his chair. I knew you'd say that. Leah was right, you're not afraid of what's right. He extended his hand. Welcome to Project Decency, Sophie. When he left, Sophie remained seated, the glass of water before her untouched. Through the window, the evening sun poured golden light across her face. In her mind, she pictured Mia dancing, her small feet spinning across the wooden floor. Sophie smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. Not from pain this time, but from the quiet certainty that something new had begun inside her. A faith that kindness and courage could coexist in the same heart, and that even a bowed head could one day rise. The next morning, when Sophie Carter walked into Hawthorne and Pine, the restaurant felt more alive than ever. The scent of freshly roasted coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft clatter of cutlery and the quiet hum of laughter drifting from the tables. Yet amid the familiar rhythm of breakfast service, something felt different. The way people looked at her was no longer out of curiosity, but respect. Carter chef Marcus Corbett's gravelly voice boomed from the kitchen. I just read your interview in the Chicago Daily. Brilliant. They called you the woman who made the world stop and listen to one honest sentence. Sophie blushed, smiling shyly. I only said what everyone's thought before, chef. Marcus waved a hand, laughing heartily. That's what makes it special. Hundreds think it, but only one says it. She turned back toward the service area where Marta was arranging glasses. I heard Leah Porter's planning an official press conference for Project Decency next week, Marta whispered. National media's coming. You'd better be ready. Sophie froze. Wait, I'll have to speak on camera. Yup, in front of hundreds of people. Don't worry, Leah said someone will help you practice. That evening after her shift, Sophie was invited to Leah's private office. The small room felt warm, the lighting soft and golden. Leah stood by the window watching the traffic roll by on the winter streets. When Sophie entered, Leah turned her smile calm, but full of pride. Sit down, Sophie, she said, her voice gentle, yet firm. Thomas Avery has confirmed it. Project Decency is officially launching, and you're leading it. Sophie lowered her gaze. I still can't believe I deserve this. Leah smiled. Neither did I when I opened my first restaurant. But sometimes, the ones who think they're too small end up doing the biggest things. She handed Sophie a folder. The project's logo was printed on the cover, two hands clasped together above the words, Dignity starts here. This contains the press release, your draft speech, and a list of partner organizations from hotel chains and airlines to labor associations, Leah continued. They don't just want to support you. They want you to represent change. Sophie flipped through the pages, her eyes trembling. I'm just a waitress. No, Sophie, Leah said, placing a hand on her shoulder. You're someone who made people believe that a waitress can have a voice. Tears filled Sophie's eyes before she could stop them. She gripped the folder tightly. Thank you for believing in me. Leah smiled kindly. Don't thank me. Just keep being who you were that night, brave and honest. That's enough. 2 days later, the press conference took place in the restaurant's grand hall. Dozens of journalists, cameras, and microphones filled the space. Flashbulbs flickered like stars, but Sophie kept a gentle smile, her hands holding a sheet of notes. Beside her stood Leah Porter and Thomas Avery. When the noise finally settled, Thomas stepped up to the podium, spoke briefly, then introduced Sophie. The room fell silent. She walked to the microphone, her heart pounding. Before her were cameras, and reporters behind her stood her colleagues, and in her mind was the image of Mia sitting in front of the television, waiting to see her mother. Sophie took a deep breath. "Good afternoon, everyone." She began, her voice calm, but resolute. "I'm not a hero. I'm just an ordinary waitress, a single mother who once lived in fear of losing her job for saying the wrong thing. But that day I realized there's something worse to lose than a job, and that's self-respect." The lights reflected in her eyes, glimmering softly as she continued. "Project Decency isn't just for restaurant workers. It's for everyone who's ever been looked down upon because they work behind a counter. From housekeepers to drivers to receptionists, we don't want to be glorified. We just want to be respected." The hall was silent. 1 second passed, then another, and then applause broke out slow. At first, then growing, spreading through the room like a rising tide. Thomas glanced at Leah and nodded. Leah smiled, pride gleaming in her eyes. At the back of the room, Marcus quickly wiped his eyes, while Victor Hale leaned against the wall, nodding quietly. That night, when Sophie returned home, Mia was waiting on the couch, her eyes shining. "Mom, I saw it. Everyone clapped for you. I told my teacher you're a real hero." Sophie laughed, pulling her daughter into her arms. "No, sweetheart, I just said something true." Mia looked up, her eyes bright. "Then when I grow up, I'll say what's true too." Sophie hugged her tighter, closing her eyes. Outside, the wind brushed past the window, carrying the faint sound of cars and the scent of snow. Inside, her fear had finally been replaced by something new, the quiet strength of truth. That night she understood that sometimes the smallest words can become a flame. And she once, an invisible waitress, had unknowingly become the one holding the torch. A week after the press conference, Chicago still hadn't stopped talking about the waitress who stood up to a billionaire. But now, what people discussed was no longer the dramatic moment at Table 9, it was what came after Project Decency. From small cafes in Logan Square to grand hotels in New York, the hashtag Had Dignity starts. Here, swept across social media. People who had worked in service began sharing their own stories of being yelled at by customers, dismissed by managers, and treated like invisible decorations. And at the center of it all was Sophie Carter, the woman with a gentle smile and resolute eyes who had become a symbol for millions of ordinary people. That morning, Sophie sat by the window of her small apartment, her coffee slowly growing cold in her hands. Outside, the wind whispered through the high rises, the clouds drifting like scattered thoughts. On the table sat a new pile of envelopes, letters sent from all over the country to the restaurant, every one of them addressed to her. She opened one at random. "Dear Sophie, I'm a hotel housekeeper in Detroit. What you said helped me look my boss in the eye for the first time. Thank you for reminding me that I matter." Sophie read slowly, tears rolling down her cheeks. Another letter came from Texas, one from Canada, even one from Paris. Every message carried the same thing: gratitude, that she had made people remember their own worth. The door creaked open. Leah Porter stepped in, holding a small box. "Sorry for dropping by unannounced," she said, smiling warmly, "but I think you should see this." Leah placed the box on the table and opened it. Inside was a beautifully crafted gold badge engraved with the Project Decency logo and the words, "Ambassador, Sophie Carter. Thomas Avery has officially appointed you as our ambassador," Leah said. "You'll attend gatherings, speak at universities, service industry events, and if you choose, do it full-time." Sophie froze. "Full-time? Does that mean I have to leave Hawthorne and Pine?" Leah nodded gently. "No one wants to lose you, but if you go, you'll carry our spirit to thousands of places. I think Marcus and everyone will understand." Sophie looked at the badge in her hand. Memories flooded back: the shout of Graham Whitaker, the pitying eyes of customers, the fear of losing her job. All those moments condensed into one heartbeat and then faded away, replaced by the faces of strangers who had written to thank her. "Do you really think I can do this?" she asked quietly. Leah smiled. I know you can, because you started all this without ever trying to be a hero, and that's exactly what makes you different. That evening, during her final shift before leaving, Sophie moved slowly through the dining room. Regular customers smiled, some quietly, gave her a thumbs up, and others left handwritten notes on their bills. Thank you for teaching us how to treat people. At the bar, Marcus set down a glass, his rough voice wavering. I heard Leah say you're leaving us. Sophie nodded softly. Just for a while. I want to see what I can do with this project. Marcus looked at her, his eyes kind. I'm proud of you. And if anyone asks, I'll tell them I once worked with the bravest woman in Chicago. They both laughed, their laughter light but warm, closing a long, stormy chapter. The following week, Sophie flew to New York to attend the first conference for Project Decency. In the grand hall flooded with light, hundreds of people listened as she shared her story, not with pride, but with quiet sincerity. That day, I was just a trembling waitress standing before a powerful man, she said. But when I found the courage to speak, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Because the only thing scarier than being fired is losing yourself. Applause filled the room, growing louder and longer. Behind the curtain, Thomas Avery watched her with the eyes of someone witnessing a small seed grow into a tree. As Sophie stepped down, she checked her phone. A message from Mia appeared on the screen. Mom, I saw you on TV. I told my friends my mom doesn't just work at a restaurant, she teaches the world what kindness means. Sophie laughed, tears spilling onto the screen. She typed back, Thank you, my love. I'm doing this for you and for everyone like me. Outside New York glowed bright, the streets pulsing with movement, but inside Sophie everything slowed. She knew she had just crossed into a new chapter, not as the waitress from Table 9 anymore, but as the woman who lit up the world's table with one simple truth. Money can buy many things, but it will never buy kindness. 3 months after that fateful night at Table 9, Sophie Carter had traveled farther than she ever imagined, from Chicago to Boston, from Los Angeles to Dallas. Everywhere she went, she was greeted not by spotlights, but by the heartfelt eyes of those who shared her story. Waiters, housekeepers, flight attendants, drivers, night shift, nurses. They came to meet the woman who had spoken the truth they had held inside for years, all through one simple sentence. At the final Project Decency conference in Washington, D.C., Sophie stepped onto the stage to a long, thunderous applause. The light illuminated her face, now radiant and confident, yet still carrying the quiet humility of someone who once lived on small tips. In the front row sat Leah Porter, Marcus Corbett, and Thomas Avery, the people who had believed in her even before she believed in herself. Sophie smiled softly, drew a deep breath, and began. 3 months ago, I was just a waitress living off tips, bowing my head to every angry voice. But that night, when I said, You can buy a steak, but you can't buy kindness, I never imagined the whole world would hear it. The room was silent. She continued, her tone gentle but unwavering. What I've learned is that every change begins with a simple moment, the moment we choose not to stay silent. You don't have to be a hero. You just have to be human enough to say, That's enough. Her words flowed through the hall like a warm breeze. Hundreds of people, many who had faced humiliation in their jobs, nodded, some quietly wiping away tears. Sophie paused, her eyes finding Leah's in the crowd. Leah smiled back, full of pride and gratitude. Project Decency, Sophie said, has shown me that true strength doesn't belong to the powerful, but to the ordinary when they stand together. And today I want to tell you this kindness is never weakness. It is the only strength that keeps us human. The applause erupted again, rolling through the room like a wave. Thomas Avery walked onto the stage and shook her hand. You've done what most people only dream of, he said softly. From one sentence, you've sparked a movement. That evening, Sophie returned to Chicago. The city welcomed her with the soft warmth of early spring. She stopped by Hawthorne and Pine, the place where everything began. The restaurant was still full golden light dancing across marble tables, the gentle clink of glasses blending with the piano's melody. It felt almost the same as that fateful night, except there was no fear left in the air. Carter Marcus's familiar gravelly voice boomed from the kitchen. He still wore his apron, his brow furrowed as always. "Look who's back!" Victor stepped out smiling. "We saved your spot at table 9 just for old time's sake." Sophie laughed and walked over. Table 9, the place where she once trembled, was now just a landmark. She ran her hand across the cool marble surface, feeling a shiver as memories flooded back, the shouting, the furious glare, and the words that had changed her world. Leah stepped out from her office, her face glowing. "Welcome home, Ambassador Carter." Sophie chuckled. "Please don't call me that. I'm still just a waitress." Leah shook her head. "No, you're proof that a waitress can change the world." The group laughed, then sat together. Marcus poured the wine, and Victor raised his glass. "To the words that reminded us, dignity has no price." They clinked their glasses, the sound soft but powerful. Later that night, Sophie returned quietly to her small apartment in Logan Square. Mia was fast asleep, clutching her ballet notebook in her arms. Sophie knelt beside her, brushing the hair from her daughter's forehead. A breeze slipped through the window, carrying the faint scent of melting snow. She looked around the small apartment, the old walls, the cramped kitchen, and yet everything felt brighter than ever. Not because of wealth, but because she had found the true meaning of living: to be honest, to be brave, and to hold on to dignity. She sat by the window, opened her notebook, and wrote the first line for her next speech. Sometimes a single sentence spoken at the right moment can make the world pause, not out of anger, but to remind us that kindness still exists. She set the pen down and smiled. Outside, the city shimmered with light. And in that small room, the soft glow of the lamp mingled with the moonlight like a quiet affirmation that wherever she went from here, Sophie Carter would remain a symbol of something simple yet profound: the truth that kindness can never be bought. From the perspective of an expert in corporate culture and human dignity, the story of Sophie Carter is not merely about a waitress who dared to speak the truth, but a testament to an unchanging value. Respect is not a privilege of the wealthy. It is the foundation of humanity. In a world where power and money often overshadow kindness, a simple sentence can still reignite the belief that people can choose what is right even when it comes with a cost.